in the Bible, the indwelling of this building is a kind of good in and of itself. And coming to the building, coming to the city of Jerusalem to take in visually the building, and even the buildings around the building is conceived to be, a extraordinary spiritual act of obedience. Its modern counterpart would be, modern Jews to this day who come to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. That the reason why the Western Wall has that kind of significance is because of its association with the temple. We can no longer see the temple, but we can see some of the stonework that participated in the glory of God that resided within the temple. And I think that that sort of religious practice is deeply biblical, and it's deeply part of the tabernacle narrative, and often, I think, ignored by modern readers.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Gary Anderson. He is Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology at the University of Notre Dame, and he is a renowned Old Testament scholar, but he's also really well known not only for being an incredible Old Testament scholar, but being able to bridge the divide that often exists between biblical and theological studies. He does a lot of really wonderful work with the biblical text in reception history, both in Jewish and Christian reception history. And I've really just appreciated his scholarship for a long time. Some of the other books that he's written, in addition to the one we're going to be talking about today, some award winners: Sin, A History, highly recommend, as well as Charity, The Place of Poor in Biblical Tradition. The book that we're discussing today, surprise, surprise, for those of you who know me, you'd know that I would be interested in this. The title is That I May Dwell Among Them, Incarnation and Atonement in the Tabernacle Narrative. This is obviously a huge interest of mine, and you can pick up on that if you've been watching the channel discussions of priesthood and sacrifice and atonement and how that factors into Christian theology. This is just a really rich discussion. I know you're going to love it, and you're here learning from one of the masters. So enjoy. Before we dive in, though, to our conversation, let me just give a quick reminder for those who have been watching us for some time and are enjoying what we're doing. Please do consider becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. All you need to do if you want to become a member is make a recurring monthly donation of any dollar amount. These are tax-deductible donations. You can use the link in the description or at the front of the YouTube page. Becoming a member gives you access to all of our past Center for Bible Study classes, entrance into all of our future classes. We've got a class on biblical interpretation coming up in January. So it's a really great opportunity to invest in your ongoing education and support the work that we're doing, both in classes and in online spaces like this. So please do consider becoming a member. And as always, please make sure that you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, or that you're following us if you're listening to us through one of the podcast media. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Anderson. Welcome, everybody. I am so delighted today to have on Dr. Gary Anderson to talk about his new book, That I May Dwell Among Them, Incarnation and Atonement in the Tabernacle Narrative. I've personally been a fan of Dr. Anderson's work for a long time. In fact, we met once. He probably doesn't remember it, but I do. I was my second year of study at the University of St. Andrews, and you actually had come out to give a paper on the strange fire on a text at St. Andrews. And I think it was my second year there. I happened to bring my copy of Genesis of Perfection with me overseas because I really loved that book, and I had you sign it for me. So I don't know if you remember that at all. Probably not, but that was a memorable moment for me, at least, getting to meet somebody that I really respected your work, and really thrilled to have you on. So thanks, Gary, for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. I apologize. I do remember going to St. Andrews. I remember the lecture, but I don't remember you personally. So
that is okay. Yeah, that is okay. It was a very quick interaction, but yeah, grateful for you. So before we dive into the book, would you be willing to share just a little bit about your path into biblical studies and what's motivated you to do the work that you've done over the course of your really long and productive career?
Yeah, I was raised United Methodist, and I actually went to a Methodist college as an undergraduate. And just by chance, really, my fall semester of my first year, I took an introduction to the Old Testament class. The textbook I can still remember was Bernard Anderson from Princeton Theological Seminary. That was a true bestseller that went through multiple editions. Many people took their intro course with the guidance of Bernard Anderson. And I guess what struck me, I was certainly a practicing Christian, a serious Christian, however, whatever adjective you prefer to use, but hadn't thought, I suppose, a lot about the relationship of the Bible to the culture in which it was created, to the realia, it presumed. And that course was just like a revelation to me that the Bible actually referred to real things in history that you could, through historical method, interrogate and get a much deeper sense of what the biblical writers were about. So I was hooked from the very first class. I don't think I ever imagined I would be going on for a PhD in that subject, but I just kept slowly wading further into the waters. My teacher informed me that if you wanted to know the Bible better, you would need to begin to learn the languages of which the Bible was written. And it was really just one step after another. And before you knew it, I was in the deep end swimming and enjoying myself, not sure how I got there.
Yeah, I hear that story quite often. That's right. And as you went on in your career, were there any things that shaped, in particular, the kind of scholarship that you felt drawn to?
Yeah, I would say so. A huge factor, and it's very difficult for me to remember how it began. I must say, maybe as a kind of parenthetical remark, I've always been kind of suspicious of the historical certainty of many historical Jesus scholars about, Jesus' own mental state about was he the Messiah, was he God, et cetera, because I think, just with respect to my own life, when I think back over, the decades now that I've lived, what led to this decision or that decision, it's very hard to get back into the space of those decisions because so much has happened in between. It's hard to know what came first, what came later. But so I can't give you, a narrative of explicit historical origination. But at some point in my career, I became very interested in Judaism and Jewish readings, especially of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And that interest was never at the expense or cost of my interest in Christian readings. In fact, the two were always side by side. I was interested in how two faith communities could read the same book and frequently come to the same conclusions, but often with, strikingly different emphases. That was a huge, and remains a huge influence on me. I think in some instances, or in some senses, we might want to say it was formative in my leaving my Protestant upbringing and becoming Catholic, because I guess what really shaped my imagination then and continues now is the way in which church and synagogue shape the character of the Bible, the notion of sola scriptura, which I don't reject. I think there is something about Scripture's plain sense that remains important and authoritative for me, but it just doesn't have the gravity it used to have. I see synagogue and church as very important constitutive players, we might want to say, in defining what Scripture is and how it ought to be read. And that's been a constant through my career. So my interest in Judaism is not just a, interest in religious pluralism or philo-Semitism. I mean, it is all of that, of course, to a degree, but it's also very existential. It's very theological. How does this text look through the eyes of a tradition, other than mine? And I've always, made that a huge point of my scholarship.
Yeah. That definitely comes through. Yeah, really great to hear you share about that. So this is another work that does a very kind of robust biblical theology, not to the detriment of certainly of historical critical scholarship, but uses that as one resource for kind of thinking about the canonical shape of the Torah and the theology that it's telling, and what it looks like to be a Christian reader, have two testaments and how they speak to one another. And so you really highlight kind of the dialogical nature of a biblical theology, that the New Testament, right, doesn't just shed light on the Old Testament, but that the Old Testament has to have its own distinct voice and continue on to contribute to our understanding of the Christ event. So I'd love if you could just kind of set out that approach a little bit for us, because I think many Christian readers in particular, when they come to thinking about the way the Old Testament speaks to the New Testament, they just think, oh, how has the New Testament picked up parts of the Old Testament? And then kind of we've moved on in the conversation. But what you show is throughout the early, tradition, you have people that are thinking theologically about Jesus in light of the Old Testament in ways that we don't see explicitly done in any New Testament book, maybe.
That's a great question. And here I would have to say, though I mentioned of course, my career became Roman Catholic, I've never really lost my interest and, let's say, affection for Protestantism. Brevard Childs, and you might want to say the Yale School, was deeply and remains deeply influential on the way in which I approach the relationship of the Testaments. Actually, what's curious to me, I suppose I'd love to do the intellectual historical work here. I've not done it. But this, value placed on the Old Testament and the way in which it can provide a kind of ballast. I'm not going to use corrective. That's not the sense, but an independent voice, or a voice filling lacuna that the New Testament doesn't have. That might be the good way to put it. Is nicely illustrated actually in the Reformed tradition. I read an extraordinary book by Eric Nelson called The Hebrew Republic, in which he documented how important it was for Reformed thinkers in the 17th and 18th century to mine not just the Bible, but this is what's so amazing, subsequent Jewish tradition, including writers like Josephus, but Talmud, Maimonides, all the way up to medieval thinkers with respect to what is the Christian position regarding religious freedom, or what type of state mechanism is most appropriate for a Christian civilization. And what he showed is that these thinkers were there's nothing in the New Testament, there's not a lot in the New Testament about this, but there's ample material in the Old Testament, and that's where they turned. And the notions of a constitutional democracy, religious freedom, et cetera, these Reformed thinkers derived all of this from the Old Testament, and it had its authoritative voice was really extraordinary. How that gets lost in the 20th and 21st century, that's a curious thing. I mean, we move to different thinkers like Schleiermacher, we can see that change, but that's a curious matter. But anyways, back to your question, where I really like Childs is that he sees we basically have two ends, a kind of continuum that is going to define a paradox. On the one hand, the New Testament isn't simply an appendix or a last chapter in a scriptural story, but it's a real game changer. The illustration I use in my book is the way in which prophecies about the building of what we might call the third temple are going to be drastically reread. In Byzantine Christianity, early Christianity is speaking to the incarnation of Christ. So here we're taking, an intentional document, let's say Ezekiel 40 to 48, and turning it on its head in light of the new event, the Christ event. So that's one element for Childs. It changes everything, once we've got, the incarnate Son of God, in place. But the other side of the thing is that the Childs always wants to argue is that for early Christian, thinkers, defining who Jesus was and developing his character was highly dependent on, showing how his character was in accord with the Old Testament. A favorite essay of mine that I often use in my teaching is by one of Child's students, Chris Seitz, in which he argues that the development in the early church of the notion of a first and second advent was driven in large part because the church realized that Jesus, doesn't fulfill everything that the Old Testament prophesies, about the coming of the Messiah. The literal realization, for example, of what's promised in Isaiah 9 and 11 simply doesn't come about. The lion does not yet lie down with the lamb. And so, as Seitz, I think, so helpfully illustrates, what we can see in early Christian exegesis is a respect for what he calls the per se voice of Isaiah. They don't try to put a round peg in a square hole. No, the prophecies that Isaiah sees as defining the moment of the eschaton, the consummation of human history, remains the final telos, or aim, for Christians as well. And we expect Jesus to come again because those promises, remain, they remain the same promises for Jews as for Christians. So that is a very good example of how the Old Testament, as it were, shapes the way in which we understand the person of Jesus without, diminishing, we might want to say, his messiahship or divinity.
Yeah. And you do a great job too in the book. You do this in a lot of your books with use of Christian art and synagogue art to make this point as well. So you use the example in the book of the prophet Ezekiel in the Sistine Chapel sharply turning his head as if in shock in the ways, in the direction in which some of the prophecy is taken in light of this radical newness. So the prophet retains his voice, but there is a newness and a rereading, if you will, that's taking place, right?
Exactly. I think that's very, very much a part of especially medieval and early modern Christian thinking of the realization that, in some senses, these Old Testament writers thought one thing, but the way in which Revelation unfurled what they thought was what something pointed to was transformed dramatically.
Right. So you're arguing, right? You're focused on the Tabernacle Narrative, and you're arguing that really this story is fundamentally about, well, it's like the heart, right, of the Pentateuch. It's the heart of God's instruction for his people, and it's the story about the divine presence. And you've got some great stuff in there about seeing the divine presence. And then it's the place where God will be served by his people, the altar that's set up, the tabernacle, so serving God. So how do these two, can you kind of summarize for the audience a little bit what you're doing with these two themes, how the Pentateuch kind of is networked together to point us to the importance of presence and what it means, what sacrifice is about in serving God. And you focus in particular on the tamid sacrifice, the daily sacrifice upon which others are built.
So the tabernacle's narrative, as I try to explain in the book, and this is certainly not novel to me, has two foci, two tele, if we're going to use the Greek words, that is, two climaxes, which is somewhat surprising. You would think, the building of the tabernacle, the appearance of God would point to a single moment, but there's a climax or a theophany, appearance of God at the end of chapter 40 when the tabernacle is constructed. And then in Leviticus 9, when the altar is lit for the first time and sacrifices are offered, God appears again. So we have these two climaxes, as it were, to the narrative. How are we to relate them? Here's where actually Jewish exegesis was a point of embarkation for me, because when you look at the Talmud and even many of the medieval Jewish thinkers, they understand these two chapters, though they're separated obviously by a lot of space, as occurring at one and the same time. That is, as God comes into the tabernacle at the same moment, he's lighting the sacrificial pyre. There's a famous, dictum in rabbinic exegesis about the Torah that there's no before or after. In other words, the literary order of the text doesn't always reflect the chronological order. And I think that's nicely exemplified here. So my book begins by trying to explain textually why this unusual, Jewish interpretation develops. And I think the clue is in Exodus 40 itself, which is a chapter that divides into two parts. A command section at the beginning of the chapter about how to assemble the tabernacle. And then the second part is Moses assembling the tabernacle. So that, I mean, at least that's the initial way to describe the chapter. But when you get into the details, it's actually a little bit more complex, because in that command section, the first part of chapter 40, we have commands about the anointing both of the tabernacle and of the priests, which points us forward to Leviticus 8 and 9. So the chapter is somewhat, confusing in that it says that everything Moses did was completed, but it's not completed within the frame of chapter 40. It's not going to be completed until Leviticus 9. So that, kind of peculiar textual detail is pulled out by rabbinic readers to make the argument that these two events happen at the same time. My own argument was a little bit more, we might want to say, apophatic, to use a technical theological term, meaning in essence, we can't really know. There's a kind of intentional confusion here, I would want to suggest, but intentional confusion with a specific theological purpose, and that is, I think the biblical writer wants us to see both of these thematic, these theme posts, we might want to say, indwelling of the tabernacle and lighting of the sacrificial pyre, as being, equally weighted in terms of their significance and equally defining the purpose for building the tabernacle in the first place. And so I spend a lot of time on the former, as you mentioned, seeing God, because I think this is the piece that modern readers, perhaps especially modern Christian readers, is going to be most foreign to them. We think of the tabernacle building as being there simply as an instrument for the altar and offering sacrifice. But in the Bible, the indwelling of this building is a kind of good in and of itself, and coming to the building, coming to the city of Jerusalem to take in visually the building, and even the buildings around the building is conceived to be, a extraordinary spiritual act of obedience. Its modern counterpart would be, modern Jews to this day who come to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. That the reason why the Western Wall has that kind of significance is because of its association with the temple. We can no longer see the temple, but we can see some of the stonework that participated in the glory of God that resided within the temple. And I think that that sort of religious practice is deeply biblical, and it's deeply part of the tabernacle narrative, and often, I think, ignored by modern readers.
Yeah, that was a part that I really latched onto in the book, was thinking through the sancta itself as being incarnational, and that the kind of rationalist perspective to want to, in a hard and fast way, separate the divine presence from the place where the divine presence is located. But you really problematize that, I think, very helpfully, as well as how that's going to play into, which we'll talk about, discussions of Jesus's body later and things like of that nature. The other thing that really stuck,
small footnote to that. So I think the best place to see this illustrated, if the listeners wanted to find, as it were, the kind of smoking gun that would, I think, prove my point, is to compare Exodus 40, the second half of that chapter, which is the instructions for how to assemble the tabernacle, with Numbers 4, which is the story of how the tabernacle is to be taken apart and prepared for its journey through the wilderness. So in chapter 40, there's no danger inherent of any of the parts. Moses or whoever is there can look at them, assemble them. There's no problem. But when we get to Numbers 4, we can see that the pit landscape is completely different. The extraordinary care in taking down the tabernacle and protecting, especially the inner furniture, from sight by the Levites and, certainly the lay Israelites, is extraordinary. How do we explain this? The only way to explain it, I think, is that once the glory of the Lord has entered into the building, everything within the building, ontologically, in terms of its being, is transformed. If you wanted to have a Christian, counterpart here, it would be certainly in a Roman Catholic, context, the consecration of the Eucharistic elements prior to the Mass, the bread and the wine. You could take them home and eat them for dinner. And there's nothing special about them. They're just, tasteless wafers and probably, cheap, inexpensive wine. But once they've been consecrated, of course, then there's all extraordinary ontological change has occurred, and Catholics can adore them, in terms of Eucharistic adoration, stare at them, as it were, because they represent the presence of God. And I think within the Hebrew Bible, I mean, we don't have exactly that, obviously, but we have an analogy to that. The tabernacle, the building, it's all of its materiality, utter materiality, is dramatically transformed. And then seeing the tabernacle is like seeing something of God's own person. I think that's basic to this distinction of Numbers 4 and Exodus 40.
No, that's really great. Thanks for that example. And you'd also really helpfully pointed out in the book the tradition of the laity when they're facing the altar, the curtain being pulled back, so that when you're gazing into, in that tradition, you're gazing into the Holy of Holies, as it were, you're seeing the furniture there, but you're seeing God like in the furniture. I think that was also a really helpful illustration to me. That's really great. Could you speak a little bit about the connection of the setting up of the tabernacle to as a completion of the work that began in creation? So the idea that the formation of the tabernacle is kind of like the final work, or the completion of what God began in the opening acts of the Bible.
Right. So the place, I mean, here one is greatly aided if you know Hebrew, because, I mean, you can point it out in English, certainly, and I have a chart in the book which will illustrate. But if you look at Exodus 39 and 40, the bringing of all the tabernacle pieces to Moses, and then its assemblage and completion, a lot of the phraseology there is repeating verbatim phraseology from Genesis 1. This has long been known. Many, many scholars have pointed out these connections. It's certainly not novel to me. We can also see this illustrated, and I do point this out in my first chapter of the book, in John's Gospel, where John 1:1 is, in the beginning was the Word, which is clearly, a reformulation of Genesis 1:1. But John 1, it's telos, using the Greek word again, climax. What it's pointing toward is chapter 1, verse 14. The word dwelt among us. That dwelling among us, as New Testament scholars have long noticed, skenoo in Greek, is referring to the tabernacling presence of God. So according to John's Gospel, creation is ordered to the incarnation, which simply is, a Christian variant on the role of the tabernacle in the Pentateuch, that creating the world is an event that has as its ultimate, goal, God's taking up residence among the people, he loves. That notion of divine intimacy, relationship to God, service to God. This is what, Scripture is about. This is what creation's about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and you point out in the book as well, as John says, when the Word becomes flesh and tabernacles among us, we've seen his glory. So there you have the divine glory and the sight of the glory, which I thought was spot on. And then in terms of sacrifice, we have all kinds of skewed ideas about what sacrifice is in the Christian tradition, probably because we interpret it back through the lens of the cross. The cross was the sacrifice. Jesus died on the cross. That was for atonement, all this kind of stuff. But what's the heart of sacrifice as you understand it and you draw out in the book?
So, I mean, you illustrate, I think, nicely one of the problems Christian readers have when they come to the Tabernacle narrative is that we associate, because of the cross, because of the atoning work of Christ, we associate sacrifice so strongly with atonement. We don't understand that there are other, goods that sacrifice, is ordered to. Also problematic frequently for Christian readers of the Tabernacle narrative is that the sacrifice towards which, the tabernacle is pointing us is not an atonement sacrifice. We have those certainly in the Hebrew Bible and Leviticus, but its goal is not that. Its goal is, as you mentioned, the tamid, the daily morning and evening sacrifice, which has nothing to do with atonement. And now the next question is, well, then what is its purpose? And now we're somewhat at loggerheads, because one of the striking things about the Tabernacle Narrative is that it tells us how to prepare the tamid sacrifice. It's very interested that the kind of cooking directions for preparing it, but it doesn't tell us, for what meal or how we're supposed to serve this, what the purpose is. And so we are, kind of guessing here when we attempt to fill out what the purpose of the sacrifice, tamid sacrifice, is. I try to suggest, I have a long discussion here. I don't want to take the whole podcast articulating my argument here. But at the end of the day, I think certainly in Jewish exegesis and ultimately also in Christian exegesis, the tamid sacrifice is tied back to the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22. And so what is the reason for that? It's not certainly here I'm a good critical biblical scholar. I don't think that, the author of Genesis 22 knew the Tabernacle Narrative, nor the reverse. Do I think that the author of the Tabernacle Narrative knew Genesis 22? But here, I think Brever Childs is very, important and constructive, is that in the final canonical shape of the Bible, whatever the original historical authors were, and let's be honest, we're just guessing here. It's not, something that the Bible itself presents to the reader as, an authoritative, datum. It's something as modern historians we've come to see. But we do have to take the final shape seriously. And Genesis 22 presents itself as a kind of etiology of the city of Jerusalem. It's where it takes place where Jerusalem will be built, and so the sacrifice that takes place there, that is Abraham and Isaac, the near sacrifice, we might want to say. It's logical to relate it to the sacrificial, practice that will define, Jerusalem, the sacrificial practice that will be defined by the tamid. And if we allow then Genesis 22 to function this way, canonically, I would say, then sacrifice in this mode of thinking is that of offering one's whole self. Either Abraham offering his, only remaining son, upon whom the entire promise that God has made depends, a kind of stupendous sacrifice, an unimaginable sacrifice, or if we take it from, Isaac's own perspective, offering his life back to God. So the tamid sacrifice ultimately in Jewish exegesis was understood to be patterned on that primal sacrifice, and that when one offered the sacrifice morning and evening, one recalled that primal sacrifice. Well, if we take that, notion, seriously, of course, it's a beautiful Jewish expression and works beautifully just on its own. You don't have to have the Christian story somehow to make sense of it. It's beautiful on its own, but it's a paradigm into which, Christ's own sacrifice fits, beautifully. And so the story of the binding of Isaac, near sacrifice of Isaac, was always understood by Christian interpreters as, a typological pointer to Christ's sacrifice. I mentioned in the very last footnote of the book, I wish I had included this image, but it was an image I discovered at the end of my, research on all of this in the Gallery of Art in London of, was the incident in Luke of presenting Christ at the temple. His mother presenting him, and the priest who receives the child is standing behind an altarpiece that looks like a, Catholic altarpiece from the High Middle Ages. But rather than having the crucifix in the middle, which of course wouldn't fit, he hasn't died yet, we have the sacrifice of Isaac. So clearly for this artist, that's the typological pointer. That's the model that Christ will assume in his own sacrifice. It's modeled on, an Old Testament, saint, venerable figure. And so I think that, at least for me, ultimately, that's what I want to suggest would be a canonical reading
Hmm.
of how the meat sacrifice is to be viewed in the book of Exodus.
Yeah, that's really great stuff. And as you get into it too, the logic of the giving, it really is it's a circular kind of rationale that God gives the gift, gives life, and the giver, or we, when we give back to God, are responding to that gift and offering a piece of ourselves through sacrifice, or as it were, perhaps our whole selves. It strikes me that Philo really likes the idea of the whole burnt offering, because for him it's an image of the total devotion of the self to God. And I also think about St. Paul in Romans 12 when he says, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. That I guess I kind of wonder with sacrifice, sometimes we focus on the giving of the self as being like the event of death, but I almost wonder if the giving of the self is more the complete devotion of the self to God, if that's
Oh,
the emphasis
absolutely.
of what sacrifice is, right?
No, I think that's a very good way of putting it. And if we went back just to two previous books of my own, I think it's the reason why my book on charity,
Mm,
we see both in the synagogue and the church the notion of giving to the poor, giving alms to the poor, as analogous to temple sacrifice.
mhm,
Most people, if you look at most handbooks, they say, well, this develops in the synagogue because the temple's destroyed. We have to have something to replace it. Which in part is true, but this idea is already found in the book of Tobit and in the book of
yeah.
Ben Sira when there
Mhm,
is a temple. So it
mhm,
doesn't have to have the temple gone for it to have the kind of gravity it has. So within the
mhm,
early church, it's one of the reasons why um, charity towards the poor developed the kind of significance and power it had,
mm,
because it was a sacrificial action. Not everyone could be a martyr, but everyone could part with a significant portion of
mhm,
their material resources.
mhm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Um, so I'd love to hear your thinking about the Christological implications of the incarnate Word, being pictured as a temple. We've already gestured towards it in John, but you get into you introduce the book with it, but then you come back to incarnation again, and you get into a discussion of a little bit of like the Christological debates about the connection of the flesh of Jesus to the Logos, and how those two are intertwined, and then how they get separated or parsed. And
Right.
then thinking also of Mary's body as a temple. I'd love to hear your thinking, just kind of a little bit about what you do there.
So very early on, I mean, obviously in the Gospel of John already, where, many scholars have noticed this, Jesus is kind of a walking temple, within the gospel. We can see that the way in which that gospel writer is understanding his divinity is deeply informed by a temple theology. And this continues to grow within the early church. One of the texts that I use to articulate this in my book is from Athanasius near the end of his career, where the question of the relationship with Arius, but maybe especially with the Nestorians that follow. Nestorius is a little bit later than Athanasius, but his ideas are already, circulating at the end of Athanasius's day. Is what is the relationship of the Godhead to the body of Christ? Is Christ simply a kind of episodic sight where theophanies of the reality of God appear? He's not necessarily integrally related to them, but he happens to be the kind of privileged figure in which these theophanies take place? Or is there something about his person that conveys this divine sense? And Athanasius, in order to this goes back to your initial question, actually, what is the value of the Old Testament in Christian theological discourse? He can't solve this problem with his theological interlocutors from the New Testament alone. He has to go back to
Mm,
the tabernacle temple model to make his point. And what he says is, we look at the Old Testament and we have this command to visit and venerate God. Well, the people of Galilee could have just did this in their own home, light a candle, say a prayer, and, God just appears there and they fulfill their obligation. Athanasius says, no, there's some kind of presence assumed in the temple that's special, that requires the Israelites to go down there. And if they don't, they'll be in violation of religious law. And he says, mutatis mutandis. I mean, similarly for Christ's person, the relationship. So the relationship of God to the stones in the temple is directly analogous to the relationship to God, to the flesh and bones of the person, Jesus. There's a kind of durative quality through time of God and his person. And Athanasius makes that point by turning to the temple, a very important, very Childsian move, we might want to say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and then of course we also, particularly in like the Gospel of Luke, the language of the glory overshadowing Mary, and so we have Mary, the Mother of God, also then she comes to be seen as a temple as well. Can you give us a little bit about what you do with her, particularly? Also, I'm really interested in the logic of why ongoing veneration of Mary is theologically important, because her body was and is still in some sense has that bears the quality of being the temple of God.
Right. So I think this is again, I think, where the Old Testament does a lot of work and maybe not fully appreciated, especially by Protestant readers who would be suspicious, maybe even in a friendly way, suspicious about the veneration of Mary, because it doesn't seem to have a New Testament basis. I wouldn't dispute that. There, New Testament texts about Mary certainly are not numerous, and they don't go into a lot of detail about her person. But what happens in the early church is they say, well, it's the God of the Old Testament is also the God of the New. And if material space is forever transformed when God enters it, as happens with the tabernacle, then wouldn't we presume that the same thing would be true when God enters the womb of the Blessed Virgin? And all of this, with respect to the laws of purity that pertain to the temple, then those also are understood to be applicable to Mary. But the key thing here, so certainly you'll find many Protestant polemicists who will say, Catholics are, worshiping Mary, and maybe some do. I don't know. I'm sure that criticisms aren't always completely inaccurate, but in terms of its historical origin, the reason why Mary is venerated is because of the person she holds in her womb, right? That's what has to be borne in mind. So that the veneration of Mary is really just an affirmation of the fact of the Godhead, she held in her own person, just as the veneration of the Western Wall isn't simply because those stones are so fantastic. That's not why Jews venerate the Western Wall. They venerate the wall because of its association with the temple and the temple in which God dwelt. And that's was always the point about Mary, is that Mary was an indication of a high Christology. The higher your Christology, the more in awe you were that Mary could, hold God and not be incinerated. One of my favorite texts from the church fathers, these are Greek fathers, is they always saw the burning bush as a analogy to Mary. Why did they say that? What human being, certainly not me, how could hold God, within their womb, within their bowels for 9 months and not be destroyed? Who's that pure? That's just impossible. So the articulation of the sanctity of her character, again, it's not about Mary. That's the important thing, but it's a reflection on the God that she houses. That's the key thing. And this develops very, early in Christian thinking. And the development of Mary's character is almost completely, Old Testament in its origin.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Thanks for that. I think a lot of Protestants are unaware of the history there, and it's helpful to just have it laid out and to see that it is whether one accepts it or not, it's an act of kind of biblical theology from the Old Testament that's being brought to bear on the significance of the Christ event. So that's really, really helpful. You don't deal with this in the book, but because I have you here, I'd love to just hear your thinking on it for a moment. When we're thinking about temple and temple as place, what do you do with the celestial temple that we have images of in like Jewish apocalyptic, and Jesus, like in Hebrews, Jesus entering into that space? How does that factor into your theology and thinking about the ways in which like Christians might even think about sacrifice today?
So I think that the reason why you have that notion develop in the Bible, of course, it perhaps goes back to the Tabernacle Narrative itself, where Moses, sees, it's not clear what tavnit exactly means in that text, that is model or whatever, what Moses sees a model in heaven, and many people have interpreted that as the heavenly temple, and then builds the temple below to match as closely as he can its blueprint. I think, if you're looking at this functionally, I think the work, as it were, the notion of heavenly temple does is to dignify the significance and importance of the earthly temple. In other words, historians of religion would refer to the temple as being kind of an axis mundi, as though a point at which heaven and earth bisect one another, so that what happens in the earthly temple is directly reflective of the divine life above. That it's not just some kind of accidental building. Let's say we could pray anywhere. Let's just pick this room and pray there. That would be hard to associate that with a heavenly room that was somehow modeled on it. You'd have to have a zillion of them. The image would just fall apart. But when you have especially a single place like you do in the city of Jerusalem, you dignify its significance, it seems to me, by articulating its ontological status in light of the heavenly building it reflects.
No, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. I was kind of trying to think through like how sacrifice could be correlated to that as well. Origen is one thinker that I've been drawn to a lot, in particular his homilies on Leviticus, and he also has a little bit in his commentary on Romans, the parts that have been preserved. But when he's thinking about the sacrifice of Jesus, he's seeing a link between the earthly altar, as it were, and the heavenly altar, and I think he's trying to coordinate then what we have in Hebrews, which seems to me Jesus offering himself in heaven as well, as a sacrifice taking place there, or an offering, priest and sacrifice going into the Holy of Holies.
Right. And so that's a great image, because there we can see within the Christian tradition, within its own, internal framework, why the atonement dimension of sacrifice, though obviously important, can't be the sum total of what constitutes sacrifice, because once we have this notion of a heavenly tabernacle, and the relationship of the divine Son to his Father is going to be construed as sacrificial in character, then that's an eternal aspect of the relationship of the Son to the Father that precedes, human life, the creation of this world. And so there must be a good, we would say, associated with that sacrificial action that has value independent of human sin that follows. And that's the dimension I really try to pick up in the last chapter of the book, is that we're not ruling out, I'm not saying atonement isn't there, but atonement is a kind of second order good in sacrifice. The first order good is that of, the Romans 12 picture of, or I would say the Philippians 2 picture of offering one's total self to God. And that act of devotion, that act of love, as it were, becomes the modality or the mechanism through which then atonement will work. But we don't have to have a situation requiring atonement for that sacrifice to be, venerable and part of the Godhead.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so the idea is sacrifice is primary. It's a way of relating to one another in self-giving. And one could even argue that if you take the need for atonement out of that, that would still be the way of relating. So that I mean, if we were extrapolating the manner in which a human would relate to the Creator in the eschaton would be in that perfect act of giving towards the Creator, like
Yeah,
that would mark one's way of living unto eternity.
right. So if I could give maybe an analogy in the Hebrew Bible here, it wouldn't be exact, but I think it would be similar. I didn't use this in my book, maybe in a forthcoming book that I'm planning on writing. It would be David's actions when he's evicted from the city of Jerusalem near the end of 2 Samuel. He's suffering the punishments that Nathan says will come upon him as the result of his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, her husband. So he's making atonement for what he did wrong by suffering these punishments. That's a super important part of the narrative. But as he leaves Jerusalem, Zadok, the high priest, brings out the Ark of the Covenant, so that it can accompany David and presumably offer him a better chance of returning to the city in glory. And David looks at Zadok and says, "No, take the ark back into Jerusalem. If God wants me to rule again in Jerusalem, He'll bring me back."
Mm.
But what's happening there? So it is atoning. There's no question there. He's atoning for his sin. He's putting God in first place rather than himself. But the modality here is that of putting his whole life at the disposal of the God he serves. I mean, that's something he should do regardless of the sin, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But in the context of the sin, of course, it's the quintessential atoning act. But it's
mm-hmm,
an act that has a goodness to it, and a value to it that
mm-hmm.
he could exemplify independent of the atoning sequence. And
Yeah.
it's that kind of paradox I think we need to utilize when we look at Christ's sacrifice. Yes, the atoning act is central. He saves us from our sins. I'm not denying that.
Mm-hmm,
But the modality of this total gift, the Romans 12 aspect, has a validity, a internal goodness to it that doesn't require human sin.
mm-hmm.
If you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. And another way of maybe getting at it would just be to say that incarnation was always plan A. It wasn't a plan B to fix the problem of sin. That was God's design always to be joined with humanity. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another kind of slightly off the wall question, but I'd love to just kind of hear your thinking. If we're thinking of Christ's body as temple in the Gospels, and we're relating the ways in which sin and impurity impact the sancta, like a la Jacob Milgram, so that the temple is this super like holy force, and paradoxically it attracts
Right.
the sin and impurity of the people, and therefore has to be prepared and cleansed. Is there any way, like, would that be too crazy to connect that line of thinking to Jesus's body in the Gospels? I'm just thinking about how much he encounters ritual impurity, and there's several ways that Gospel scholars go with it. One is that Jesus just didn't care about ritual impurity, or the evangelists didn't, which I don't think is correct. There's another way is something about the incredible holiness in him that overwhelms various forms of ritual impurity. I think Matthew Thiessen ties them all in, as Milgram does, to kind of like having to pertain to mortality in some sense or whatever. But I guess my extension of that, what I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, and it may, admittedly, it may be a little bit like wacky, but is there a sense in which Christ's body in those scenes is bearing the consequences of being human, being with humanity, and that in some cases, in some sense, his resurrection his death and then resurrection serves in some form as a kind of purification, if you will, of the body. I know that sounds maybe crazy, but I'm just wondering about that incarnational aspect of, we think about God incarnate being with us, bearing our sins, but I wonder if there's actually a tangible consequence of him bearing sin and impurity.
So, I guess I would say a couple of things. I haven't, first of all, given this a tremendous amount of thought, so
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to speak too authoritatively here. I'm also, Jesus is, as it were, a walking temple, but we have to be, careful in terms of how, what lines connect and what lines don't connect. So it
Sure.
doesn't mean that everything about the temple, instantly, is correlated to Jesus' person. But now, having said that, there are two ways, though, certainly when we think of early Christian practice, that the concerns that you just articulated are certainly followed up upon. One would be the habit that early Christians had. I don't know how early this is, but it's very, very early, of interring the body of saints within altars, within churches, which, of course, according to Old Testament law, would be strictly forbidden. So where does this come from? Here, I think, and again, I speak with a little bit of hesitation because it's not my domain. Anyone who's listening to me should check the details further before presuming I'm correct. But as I understand it, the reason why Christians will inter the bodies of martyrs within churches is not because Numbers 19 is no longer valid. Rather, those bodies were understood to be participating in the resurrected body. So they weren't subject to the laws of impurity as defined by, Levitical law. So in a way, they were actually upholding the validity of those laws by putting the character of the martyr's body in a kind of frame different from that of ordinary human bodies. Then also, the reason why we have, what develops in the East, the iconostasis, that is the chancel screen that will divide the laity from the altar. All of this, has to do with the purity laws of the Old Testament. It's simply taking the physical structure of the tabernacle cum temple and making it the blueprint for the Christian church, and then viewing Eucharistic, vessels, for example, handling them. All of this was treated very early within, Christian canon law on the basis of these Levitical models. Again, the presumption being here that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New. And if you have, sancta, within the domain of the church, it's going to follow the rubrics articulated in the Old. So in that sense, the kind of purity legislation continues. And in fact, in the early Eastern Church too, Leviticus 12, this is partly Marian, the restriction of the woman who's recently delivered from coming to the temple applies to coming to the Mass. It's no longer practiced, but there was a ritual of the churching of women in which they would not return to Mass for a while after they had borne their child, in imitation of what Mary does in Luke's Gospel. It goes back to, of course, Leviticus 12 in the Old Testament.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks. I appreciate you indulging me. I know that was an off-the-wall question, and it's just something, I don't know, I've been kind of chewing on. Last question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So you emphasize that thinking about Jesus as atonement in an Old Testament sacrificial model really helps us get away or develop a kind of a non-putative modality of thinking about the atonement. It's very common for people to think that Jesus was punished by God, declared guilty, kind of a penal substitutionary model. But I agree with you. I think the more you think through sacrifice, the harder it is to imagine that if there is a penal substitution, it's not coming from sacrifice. It's coming from something else. But yeah, could you just unpack your thinking on that a little bit for us?
Here, speaking as a kind of systematic theologian, I think there's a great book by a famous Swiss Jesuit from the 20th century, von Balthasar, titled "Only Love is Credible." And I think if you're thinking, apologetically in terms of the projection of the Christian message into the world, you want to ground the atoning act, the saving act of Christ in love, in an act of love. And that has to come primary. Now, it has to be an act of love that somehow is dealing with the consequences of human sin, to be sure. But I think the kind of, I would say, crude picture of, punitive atonement generates a God that most people, would not want to worship. So the question then becomes, in terms of how we read the Gospels, how we expound the Gospels, how can we do justice to the Son of God who offered his life on our behalf? We who are, sinners without aid, but how can we tell that story in a way that puts the love of God front and center? And I guess that's what I tried to suggest, within my book. Goes back to the story of the binding of Isaac, which is, utilized significantly by Moses in his prayer of intercession, for the people of Israel in Exodus 32. The notion of a devotion of that nature, a revelation of an individual's, total consuming love of God, is so extraordinary that it can cover over, as it were, pay for the debt of our sins. I think that's the kind of story I would want to tell about how it is that our sins are dealt with by God, and why a sacrificial death of this sort was necessary. We'll go back to my story about David. I mean, David's crime was a serious crime, and being thrown out of his capital city was an appropriate punishment. But the way the Bible tells that story is it's not God just settling a score here, right? Which we sometimes have in these kind of punitive, penal atonement, narratives. It's, making David, a suitable vessel for, God's, continuing work with him as king over Judah and Israel. And to be a suitable vessel, he has to be an individual who recognizes that, he's in second place, God's in first place. So that action is quintessentially atoning. It's punitive, yes, but the punitive element is, I think, runs side saddle, as it were, to the more formative, devotion side. His Christian language, it's an act of divinization. He's being incorporated into the kind of pattern of life that we see in Philippians 2. That the Son of God realizes in his own person. And it's a pattern of life that's valuable and imitatable, prior to sin and after sin.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your work on this book. I'm going to come back to it more and more. I am myself trying to wrestle through some kind of project on sacrifice in the New Testament, and this is giving me a lot to think about personally. So thanks for your work. I highly recommend everybody. This is a really, really excellent book, so you definitely want to check it out. Thanks, Gary. I really appreciate your time, appreciate your scholarship.
Thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me onto this podcast.
Yeah. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.